We are going to move forward, and tonight we're going to talk a little bit about some of the specific disabilities that we may encounter in our adventures in assessing and working with folks who may require AAC. Probably the most common diagnosis that you're going to encounter is cerebral palsy, or CP. Recall that is what Leanna contends with. She has cerebral palsy. It's a neuromotor disorder. It's not considered progressive from the standpoint that we don't see the person in their physical condition deteriorating over time like we might see with something like muscular dystrophy or MS or spinal muscular atrophy, one of those conditions. It's considered a chronic condition, meaning that the problems that are associated with it are ongoing and relatively speaking stable, although if we don't intervene, if we don't take certain precautionary measures, they can run into lots of complications like contractures, joint fixation, things of that nature. So a lot of work needs to be done to prevent complications, but the condition itself is not progressive. It's a fairly common condition occurring about 1 in every 500 births. So we have not seen much fluctuation in the incidence rate over time. Whereas some conditions, there seems to have been an increase or an influx, like with autism. We've not really seen any significant changes upward or downward in incidence and prevalence rates with CP, so it's relatively stable. Typically, folks that have CP have a relatively normal lifespan. They typically will grow into adulthood, although it is somewhat shorter than the general population, and usually that's due to the chronic nature of their condition, that makes them more prone to some complications over time. It's often associated with premature birth, and about half of those cases the baby has a stroke. They have a brain bleed, a hemorrhagic stroke. In full-term kiddos, something happened during prenatal development in about a third of the cases, where just something happened and their brain just didn't develop normal. And they have CP. Nearly half of the cases have no known cause. Leanna's case, obviously, there's pretty clear indication that medical procedures were performed repeatedly that should not have been, that weren't designed for that, and medical procedures that should have been implemented were not, and as a result of that medical incompetence, she had brain injury. And so if that makes it easier to wrap your brain around, just think of CP as a brain injury that occurs before, during, or somewhat immediately following birth. Because technically, if a child suffers some sort of a brain injury that results in motor impairment prior to about the age of 18 months, they will still consider it CP. I never realized that. I always thought they had to have happened before or during the birthing process. But technically, by definition, neurologists will say they'll go out to about 18 months of age. So for example, if you have a shaken baby, that child may be described as having CP based on their symptoms. Okay. So in many cases, we really don't know. We always describe CP in terms of the type of motor impairment that they have and in terms of the location. So what part or parts of the body are being affected and what types of symptoms are they displaying? That's going to determine how we describe it. So are they showing spasticity? Do they have increased muscle tone? Are they having flaccidity where they have low muscle tone? Are they having some sort of a dyskinesia or a dyskinetic where they might have athetosis, which is uncontrolled movement, difficulty initiating and stopping motion? Or do they have some sort of a dystonia, which is sort of a repetitive, tremorous, uncontrolled movement? They could have ataxic symptoms where they have poor coordination and movement, or they could have mixed, where they have some combination of two or more of the others. And then we describe the location. Are they hemiplegic, meaning that one whole side of the body is affected? Are they paraplegic, where the lower extremities are involved, or diplegic, where it's just the upper extremities involved? Or is it quadriplegic, because all of the extremities are involved? So, does anyone remember, or even if you don't remember, would you care to hazard a guess as to which type Leanna has? Mm-hmm. And then what type? I think that she had mixed, because if I'm remembering correctly, because she does have both a combination of increased and decreased muscle tone. So that would be mixed. I'll verify that with Mom, but I'm pretty sure that she had some of each, and they noticed that when she was an infant, that she was showing both increased and decreased. I don't know what IT is doing, but every freaking computer I've been on today has been wanting to shut down and update. I've been in 3 different buildings today. So typically what you will hear or see is the type of motor dysfunction first, and then the location. So you might see that a person has a mixed, spastic, flaccid, quadriplegic cerebral palsy, or they might have an athetoid hemiplegic cerebral palsy. So you typically will see the type of symptom or motor presentation first, followed by the location when they make the description. Okay? Not always, but typically that's what we will see. From an assessment standpoint, thinking about the things that we talked about Tuesday, what special considerations do you need to keep in mind when assessing someone that has CP? Think about those different domains. Remember the assessment domains? What are some of the assessment domains that we talked about? Those assessment areas. Yes?
The OT would help in having placement and seating.
Yeah, positioning, fine motor control are going to be major issues, and we really are going to need the help and input of an OT because they're going to help us figure out even what's the most reliable type of access. So let me ask you, because I've heard different people say different things. We know that if a patient is, well, what's direct selection as an assessment? Well, and that's the question. Is it only direct selection if the patient uses their finger or mouth stick or something like that? Or is someone who's using a dot system, like Leanna has, where they're focusing and honing in on it? There are those that say, no, that's scanning. There are those that say, that's direct selection. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer to this, but who would say if you have a head pointing dot that you're using reliably, that's direct selection? Anyone honestly feel like that's scanning? Yeah, I agree. I don't know that we're right or wrong, but I have heard an increasing number of people referring to that as scanning. And to me, they're directly picking what it is that they want. So just because they're not physically touching it, to me, because those same people that I hear say this have no problem where if they have a head pointer or a mouse stick and they're using that it's direct selection. So if the device is designed in such a way to read where it is that dot is focusing, then why is that not direct selection? But anyway, so we definitely need to take into consideration their motor control issues and how they're going to most reliably access the device. And our friends in OT are really going to help with that. What about, bless you, by the way, whoever that was. What about cognition? Are we typically overly concerned about cognitive function, folks with CP? Let me ask you this. In all of the video clips that we have seen, and in our live individual that we had here, did any of them have marked cognitive impairment. You think about the guy who coordinates his schedule of friends to help him so that he doesn't need, around the clock care. Think about the young lady that was in college, so obviously she must not be too dull because she's in college. Leanna, typically folks with CP have very typical, normal, average to above average intelligence. They have motor issues that are interfering, but cognition is usually intact. So we don't typically have to be overly worried about that. Now, you're not going to screen, make some observations or comments, but, and certainly if you have concerns, you're going to make a referral. Who would you refer to if you had concerns about cognition? Psych or neuropsych? Preferably neuropsych. That's their specialty. So just thinking in terms of those different assessment domains, probably our main thing that we're going to be concerned with is their motor skills in terms of access and their language skills. At least receptively. Okay? All right. So, having said that, there are studies that say up to 50% folks with CP do have some degree of cognitive impairment. But these are most likely to be seen in cases of quadriplegia and oftentimes in cases where there is some sort of trauma. So like shaken baby. Things of that nature. Preemies, maybe, depending on the nature of their deficits in terms of what caused. But we're typically not talking like severe to profound cognitive impairment. We're talking more like borderline cognitive impairment, where we know that the normal range is 85 to 115 IQ. And a lot of times we might see kids that are like in the 79, 83, in that high 70s, low 80s range that are really not considered mildly cognitively impaired yet. Because it isn't the cutoff. I think the cutoff for mild cognitive impairment starts at an IQ of 69. So what do we do with those people that are like from 70 to 85? They're borderline. So don't take that as like contradictory because we're talking relatively subtle, mild. A lot of them may not be a true cognitive impairment, it may be a learning disability. The incidence of learning disabilities is really high because visual acuity and visual perceptual deficits are very common. So that could lead to learning disabilities. Pardon. There's usually 3, but I think I'm done. Sorry about that. Surprisingly, I think, maybe it's not to you, but I think it is surprising. Language deficits and hearing deficits are relatively uncommon. Only about 30% of the cases have a language or a hearing deficit. But about 80% of them have dysarthria, and that's why they need AAC, because their speech is so severely dysarthric to render it not functional. What is dysarthria? You guys haven't had motor speech disorders yet. Here at Miami, we don't teach that until the graduate level, but we've talked about it in other classes. Probably talked about it in neuro. I know we talked about it a little bit in 127, if you had me for that. So what dysarthria is a motor speech disorder where muscles are or are not impaired. Muscular activity is impaired. As opposed to apraxia, where it's a motor speech disorder where muscular activity is not impaired. So with dysarthria, there's impaired muscle function. Whether it's weakness or incoordination, it's there. So their speech is often very labored. It is very difficult to understand. They make very consistent types of errors, as opposed to folks with apraxia that make very inconsistent, unpredictable errors because there's a short circuiting of the signal between the motor strip and the articulators. In this group of folks, it's the motor strip and or the brainstem that is, or the cerebellum, combination of all of those, that's involved that renders muscle movement abnormal. Okay? And then about half of the cases, not quite half, have some sort of a seizure disorder. Why do we care about that? Anyone here ever witnessed someone who's had a seizure? What were they like afterwards? Kind of out of it, very lethargic, maybe somewhat confused. They call that a post-ictal state. And so we do want to kind of know how often are they having seizures, if at all. Because, frankly, I don't know I'm going to evaluate them right after they've had a seizure. And I've had that happen where the mom will say, oh, he's a little out of sorts right now. He had a seizure right before we came. Maybe we should reschedule the assessment because we're probably not going to get the most realistic or representative picture of what they're able to do. But at the same time, we may want to see what they look like, how they act after a seizure, because they may not be able to access their communication system reliably or as functionally after they've had a seizure to be then at a time when they've been seizure free. So you need to kind of be aware. Sometimes the medications that they use for controlling seizures can have side effects that we would be concerned about as well. So you do want to know. Okay. Another area of interest to us, another condition that we may encounter, and it's actually, we're encountering it more and more, is in the population of folks who have intellectual impairments or intellectual disabilities. We really did not see AAC of any kind being introduced to folks with cognitive impairments or intellectual disabilities in the mid-80s. So back when I was in graduate school, we were just starting to really see any kind of attempts at using AAC for folks that have cognitive impairments. Until then, pretty much left them to their own devices, which is unfortunate. Times and laws and attitudes were changing. We have to consider when we are assessing these folks, though, what's realistic. AAC systems have a much higher cognitive burden than others. And we have to take that into consideration. If you have a person who's relatively high functioning, so has an IQ in the mild range of impairment, then I think we can be much more flexible. We have a lot more choices in what we're going to consider for them. But once we start getting into the moderate, the severe, and profound ranges, I think we're much more limited. Maybe to something like a picture exchange, maybe an eye gaze. But if we're in that mild or that borderline category, then I think we have a lot more choices. Depending on severity, it's not an uncommon condition. Between 1% and 3% of the population, depending on severity. What percentage of the population stutters? 1%. So this is as, if not more common than stuttering. And I bet every single one of you knows at least one person who stutters. Typically, if you know one, you're going to know several because it usually runs in families. Like my wife's father, his brother, their father, before he passed away, and two of her cousins stuttered. There's more working in the corners because it does run in families. So with cognitive impairment, chances are good that you know someone. It's the most common cause of cognitive or intellectual impairment. Down syndrome. Down syndrome is one of the most common, if not the most common, genetic condition in the U.S. And cognitive impairment of some degree is frequently associated with it, not always. There are a lot of folks with Down syndrome that have actually normal IQs. I can remember years ago there was a TV show called Life Goes On. It was about a family and their son who had Down syndrome. And it was the actor who played the character actually had Down syndrome. On the show, he had a girlfriend who also had Down syndrome, and they were obviously bright enough to they went to high school. They were able to memorize their lines. So there's a range. I had a young lady that I worked with who had Down syndrome who was an escape artist. She loved to get away, go out and explore the neighborhood. And every single door and window lock that her parents tried, she was able to figure it out. She even was able to watch. They even resorted to like keypad touch, and she was able to watch them and figure out what the codes were. So basically, short of handcuffing her to something in the home, they basically had to say, okay, we're trying to stop her from eloping by putting barriers. Why don't we try and educate her on why she shouldn't be doing this, that if she wants to go out, to get someone to go with her. Amazingly, when we talked to her about the risks, she understood safety and all of that. She typically, they would find her on the roof in front of her. She had a dormer window in the bedroom. And so she would find out and find her sitting, feet hanging over the gutters. She said her goal was to get out of high school and go to the University of Kentucky so she could marry a football player. I said, okay. She's got a plan. Sid's going to marry well and be fine. And actually, they did IQ testing on her, and I think her IQ came out like 87, 88. So low average. She'll be fine. She actually came in one day. She goes, I had been seeing her since she was little, and by this time she was like 12. She was really mad. She's like, we had career day today at school. I said, we did. Why are you mad? I can tell by the way you said we had career day today. And she said, yeah. I don't know why. They told me I could go have an extended lunch rather than sit in on the career day stuff. I was like, really? She goes, yeah, I think this is what she said, I swear. This tells you how smart this kid was. She goes, yeah, she said, I think they have visions of me being a bagger at Kroger. And I was like, okay, Sid, so what do you want to do? And she said, well, I don't know, but that's why I wanted to go to career day. We'll talk to them because it was going to be an ongoing thing. So needless to say, the next day she wasn't having an extended lunch. But yeah, that was so funny. Like, even she has a stereotype. I'm like, Sid, stop. You're killing me. But anyway, so it's a relatively common condition, and they account for a fairly significant number of non-speaking school-aged kids. As I said, it's frequently seen in Down syndrome. It's also very commonly seen in autism and pervasive developmental disorders as well. Which actually, I think, they did away with Asperger's. I think they did away with PDD as well. I think Asperger's and PDD are now all. I know Asperger's, but I think PDD is also now under autism spectrum disorder. You might be convincing that. So, with these folks, motor skills are often not as significant of an impediment or significant of an indicator of what type of system we're going to use. Normally, they don't have quadriplegia. Normally, they might have a little bit of fine motor control issue, they might have a little bit of information, but it's usually not enough to interfere like with direct selection, for example, or a gestural system. But depending on their level of cognitive impairment, we may really have to spend some time in that domain trying to figure out what's going to be the most appropriate type of system for them. What would you do if you had, say you had a kid with Down syndrome who was somewhat dysarthric and difficult to understand, maybe had a mild cognitive deficit, even a moderate cognitive deficit. Recommend for them.
One of those AAC and non-tablets were the ones that are
Okay.
encased,
Okay.
and then just make pretty bigger to begin with.
Okay.
They might be having more force, but they're quite easy.
So more overlays, more pages, embedded pages. That might be an option. Particularly if they have pretty good motor skills, you can get it either with or without the overlay, the plastic overlay to help. That might be an option. Tablet might be an option. Not gestures. I've seen, particularly in children with Down syndrome who are late talking for whatever reason, they do often respond afford to make the motor demands a little bit more. So that's why having some sort of a direct selection type of system might be very appropriate.
So could you almost have something then that has like a very small brain that would have lots of options on it, if their motor skills are good, because then you wouldn't have to go through as many pages, it'd be like more options for you.
Typically, they're going to have like a main navigational page that they can then hop to other things from. So yeah, we can definitely do that. But again, every type of condition that we work with is going to have different assessment domains that we're going to have to really be mindful of. Some of it's all of them, but others, it's really particular ones that we have to hone in on. Obviously, we're always going to be concerned about language skills, receptive and expressive language skills. But in terms of what are the other domains that are going to have the biggest impact on their success or lack of success, it's really going to vary by diagnosis. Okay. So, let's think about all this. We have a kid who's on the spectrum. And we know that they have impaired social interaction, they have significant impairments in communication, and they have these abnormal behaviors. When should we consider the introduction of some sort of an AAC system for kids with autism? Kind of universal rule of thumb.
Well, I don't know if I know the universal rule of thumb, but I was just thinking, if they aren't communicating in like any other like person-to-person method isn't working. Like if they're not engaged with like a picture board or something like that, then there's that kind of motivates them.
Well, to me, it's sort of like the question which came first, the chicken or the egg. Why is the child with autism not communicating? Is it because they lack the intent, the desire to interact with others, or are they not communicating with others because they don't have a reliable system for doing that? So, to me, I think that the time to introduce some sort of alternative is from the get-go. Because maybe that is how you build communication intent. If they don't have any desire or need to communicate, they're not going to. It's sort of like when I ask you guys a question and everyone sits there and I feel like I need to maybe get out a hanky and wipe drool off of their chins. It's not, you don't have the desire to communicate with me at that time. That's okay. But I'm just saying, at that time, you're not motivated. Maybe if I said, here's an oversized, king-size Hershey's chocolate bar for the first person who answers, I might get more response. But then you all would be cursing me in the spring when you can't get into your nice dresses for graduation and you get you too much chocolate. So I'm screwed one way or the other. It's a lose-lose situation for me. But you get my point, is that if there's not a desire to communicate, communication is not going to happen. But with children who are on the spectrum, that's our dilemma. Why is there no desire? Is there no desire because it's just inherently part of the spectrum of symptoms of autism? Or is there no desire to communicate because they've not had a reliable method to communicate that's gotten them success? So, what do we know about children on the spectrum? What are some things that they do learn? humans, but
They like structure, they like technology, they like things.
yes, they like stuff. So this is, and I guess for me, just because I've seen, for the longest time, picture exchange was the most common method because it's what we had. But since the advent of tablets and how kids on the spectrum do tend to particularly like gadgets and technology, um, to me it's almost a no-brainer. That would be the first thing I would try. I think I would skip over text or any kind of picture exchange, except in rare situations. I think I would try and go straight to some sort of a tablet-based device, just because we can use it for much more than just communication. They can use it for learning. There's educational apps. They can use it for entertainment. Um, yes, ma'am.
Have you seen a lot of situations in children with autism that, like, once they have the tablet though, they like don't like get distracted and they don't want to do what you have planned for them to do necessarily?
I think that there's always that risk, but I think if you introduce it in a structured manner, and so they become accustomed to it being more of a tool than just something to randomly
Like,
engage with, and it's certainly not for everyone. We watched the video from 60 Minutes where they had the study that's going on in Canada, and they had the three teachers. Did we watch that in
yeah,
Canada?
with
We had the kid that loved opera, who knew the kid loved opera, and they were able to assess him, and his receptive vocabulary was like off the charts, and they thought that he was functioning like at a 2-year-old level. And so I think if we work and collaboratively introduce the technology in a structured fashion like that, where they get used to it being utilized in different capacities, I think that we have a better chance of it not becoming just something that they perseverate on. But there's always that risk, and it's not for everyone.
like how would you introduce it in like a structured way? Like especially if they had one at home that like their parents would play games on, like how like I don't know, what would you do?
First of all, if they already have one, I'd probably say, hey, can we bring that to school? And I'd load what we wanted onto there, where I would make sure that we had a lot of the same things for using one exclusively at school, and that we try and have a lot of the same things on so there's consistency, so the screen looks the same. And I think that you try and build in structure and routine that way with them, and they only get access to the fun stuff after or as a reward for, for a communication attempt or completing a lesson or whatever it might be. But I think that if you put in some sort of contingencies and limit their access to the non-essential stuff, but everyone's got to be on the same page. I think that's the key. Sometimes that's really, really hard. Because I'll be honest, I mean, I've seen, and I'm sure you have seen, imagine if you're the parent of a child with special needs like autism. You also have 1 or 2, 4, 6 other kids. Suddenly you have this device that keeps your kid with autism engaged for hours on end. There are going to be days where it's a real temptation to just let that device babysit them so you can actually get other things done. And I'm not going to pass judgment on the parent who does that. But as a professional, it frustrates me because it kind of defeats the purpose. So, but that's, to me, I think that the potential benefits of using high-tech devices, particularly tablets with children on the spectrum, far outweigh the potential pitfalls, especially if we try and approach it together and we're all on the same page. I mean, maybe we don't introduce all that fun stuff until after we've established a pattern. And I don't know, I'm not sure I have the answer because most of the kids that I have recommended tablets for have problems other than autism. That's not my area of expertise, so I haven't really. I'd be very interested in Dr. Timler's take on tablet use with children with autism, and maybe with my experience doing some research related to apps, her expertise with autism, maybe she and I can put our heads together and do a joint study. That might be really interesting. Goodness knows we now have enough iPads downstairs. Do we have like 10 or something?
I think it's 8.
8? Yeah, so I mean, we got that technology grant. I'd love to see them use them. Any of you stick around for grad school, I'm sure that could be a good use. Anyway, so unlike our kids with cerebral palsy, where they usually have a real desire to interact, they just are these normal, otherwise normal individuals locked into a body that's not cooperating with them. We have kind of the opposite with children on the spectrum. Typically their bodies are working fine, it's their mind and their brain that's kind of locked in. And so we have very different concerns that we need to consider when we're working with them. The earlier that we can intervene, the earlier that we can introduce any kind of technology, any kind of methodology for promoting communication intent and social interaction, the more likely we are to see some communicative success. But again, you're going to be doing an assessment, at least initially, I would keep that list of the domains kind of handy and kind of pre-plan through, okay, I know the kid has been diagnosed with this, and this. Which of the domains do I really need to likely be most concerned with or make sure that I have good information about because they're most likely to impact. And I think for your kids with CP, it's the motor domain. Obviously kids with cognitive impairment, it's going to be the cognitive domain. And I think for kids that are on the spectrum, it's going to be their linguistic competence and their social interactions. Does that kind of make sense? It's really not rocket science. So much of what we end up doing, every year, KP does interviews and a survey of our grad students in their rotations, as well as the supervisors of our grad students. And invariably, when we get into looking at the results, a lot of times you'll see students say, we need more on treatment techniques for motor speech disorders. We need more on treatment techniques for, I don't know, articulation. A lot of it is the same, regardless of the diagnosis. It's just applying it slightly differently. And it's kind of the same with this. You already know how to do a pretty thorough assessment. There are just other areas and they may even be areas that you're not going to be the one assessing, that you have to have the information about that you need to be able to But I would kind of liken our kids on the spectrum and our CP kids as kind of polar opposites. Normal brain function, locked in body versus normal body function and a locked in brain function. That helps you to think of that dichotomy. But we do know, so I disagree with this, that intellectual impairment is common in autism. Depending on whose research you read, it varies anywhere from 25 to 75%. But I would say this, how do we typically assess intellectual capability? IQ tests, right? What's a problem with IQ tests? They're language loaded. They tend to grossly underestimate the cognitive or intellectual capabilities of children who have hearing impairment. They tend to grossly underestimate the cognitive capabilities of children from ethnic, racial, and or socioeconomic minorities. So do you think they might grossly underestimate the cognitive capabilities of children who, by definition of their diagnosis, have a significant language problem? Even if we take the language part out, okay, because there are tests of cognitive function that are not linguistically loaded. What's the other major problem of children with autism? It's the triad, diagnostic triad. They have impaired communication, they have behavioral abnormalities. What's the other problem that they have? Social interaction issues. In order for you to get a reliable measure of a child's cognitive and intellectual function, they got to be willing to engage with you around the test. I think maybe that might impact the results that we get. So I would just say, really be skeptical about the incidence rates of cognitive impairment in children that are on the spectrum, because I really think that the whole assessment process for cognition is wrought with pitfalls, and that may dramatically skew the results even of some of the most skilled testers. So, is it possible that they have cognitive impairment? Absolutely. Is it likely that some percentage of them do? Yes. Some percentage of the general population. I don't know that I have ever read anything compelling to suggest to me that the incidence of cognitive impairment is nearly as high as what we've historically assumed. That's just me. And I will admit, I am not an expert on autism. I have not seen hundreds and thousands of kids on the spectrum like some of my colleagues have. But from my experience and from the research literature that I've reviewed, I'm always a little skeptical at the end when I see such high numbers as like 75%. I think it's reasonable to assume that the incidence of cognitive impairment is going to be higher in the population of children with autism spectrum disorders because we know their brains are different. We know that they're differently wired. But I'm not sure that I'm willing to leap to that force of a cognitive impairment. Grace, you were going to ask something?
Yeah. Is it possible, this is a question, to do an IQ test
I'm sure that it probably has been. And if you think about it, because we saw, it's not a dumb question, it's a very good question. And again, thesis choice for someone down the road. But think about it, when we saw the video presentation and the male teacher was interacting with our little opera buff, he was giving a vocabulary test. He did an expressive or receptive or both. I'm not sure. They just said he was doing, a vocabulary test with him. I guess it was receptive because he had to point to the picture that corresponded to the word. So obviously, if we could do a receptive language test with the device, what would prevent us from doing?
You do it with the standardized test, I'm just thinking like, we're taking something like ACT or a high graduation test. That would make a difference, or if it would have to be significantly modified, because to me, I wouldn't think it has to be significantly modified, but I know that there are.
Yeah, because I mean, is there a touch screen?
Well, the GRE is, but ACT is pretty close, so.
But it seems to me there'd be no reason why they couldn't come up with a touch screen version. There's your first million right there. You develop the electronic touchscreen version of ACT. I remember when she brought that up in Dr. Hunt's 427 class, and now she could buy and sell all of us because she had that idea. What were you gonna say? Right. But to me, if that's what they need in order to be able to show what they're capable of, no. This is, I love it when you guys ask questions, but I'm going to throw a shoe at you the next time you say, this is probably a stupid question, because the only stupid question is the one that you didn't ask. You should know that from me by now. Don't do that.
The video of the girl who saw college.
Uh-huh.
I can remember she had having really good,
I think she, I'm trying to remember what her mode of access was. She had a lot of head bobbing, so I'm sure it wasn't an eye gaze system. I think she must have had some, now that I think about it, I think she did have some like upper extreme, yeah, because she really used a joystick for her pictures.
but for someone that can do that, how would they even bother taking a test to go to college? I feel like it should, but how would they do that? Is there another way to do that?
I'm thinking that there must already be, there has to be a way. Or maybe they have an aid where they read the question, they use some sort of a communication system to tell them the aid marks their answer. I think we need to look into that. College testing board, isn't that?
ATS doesn't use.
I remember, I started high school back in the 70s, and it was like applying to college in the early 80s. So things were really different.
It just seems like they place so much importance on these standardized tests for, not just for graduation, but for every next step.
Right. Yeah, I
Is
mean,
that
it's,
there has to be an
Yeah.
access point.
I would think that there has to be some sort of accommodation that's kind of universal. See, You asked a very good question because now no one's ever asked me that before, and I hadn't really thought of it. But you guys are in that boat because you're all taking the GRE and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it would make sense you're thinking that way. So I'll see what I can find out. I'll throw them a hypothetical. I'm a speech pathologist. I have a patient who uses a communication device and a touch screen. All right. But keep in mind that particularly with kids that are on the spectrum, we have to figure out a way to get them to want to communicate. Because otherwise, as Nicole pointed out, they're just going to engage with this device as a way of stimming or as a way of keeping themselves entertained. We need to make sure that we work on communication intent. And one of the things that I have found is that I'm no expert on autism, but the one thing that I did learn over time was that if I have not been able to observe a desire to communicate and interact with others, it doesn't matter what mode of communication I try, whether I try some sort of picture exchange, whether I try gestures, whether I try, computer. In children on the spectrum, if you have not established or can't establish that there's a communication intent there, you're going to find yourself frustrated. And I have colleagues that would say that, are you saying then that if they're not demonstrating their communication intent, that you're not going to work with them? Well, no. I am, but I need to realize that that needs to be a primary focus of my treatment, is to try and build and establish that desire to communicate. Because otherwise, it's sort of like the patient who stutters. I can show them the strategies that they need to utilize in order to not stutter. But if they don't choose to use them, particularly outside of their interactions with me, how should they going to stutter? It's like the voice client that you work on altering their pitch and their intensity patterns. They sound great in the therapy room, but the minute they walk outside, they fall back into their previous habits, and guess what? Their voice isn't going to improve. And so, to me, it's kind of the same thing. We haven't established or built communication intent. We shouldn't be surprised if communication's not taking place. It doesn't really matter. The method that we use becomes irrelevant. So we've already kind of talked about this a little bit, but what are the main factors that you want to consider when you're assessing and making recommendations for someone on the spectrum? Not a big one. What's their level of social interaction and communicative intent? And so it may be that we need to work on those skills before we even make a final decision about what type of communication mode or communication system we're going to try. In the meantime, I think a tablet's often a really good choice, simply because there are a lot of instructional materials and apps that we can use in the meantime. And there are things like the creepy eyes ones that look here, and it like flashing at you, like, ooh. Or, the emotion ones where it helps them learn to identify and react to emotions. So there's a lot that I think that, to me personally, I think my default almost would be in working with children on the spectrum would be to introduce a tablet, just because I can use it not just for communication, but for instruction. But what are some of the other implications then? Nicole, what did you point out?
Picture exchange. Oh, wait. Besides with the tablet, you said?
With the tablet, what?
Oh.
Yeah.
With the tablet. Well, I know what you mean.
Well, that you totally run the risk of them,
Getting distracted. And
having
wanting
a distraction.
to
Absolutely, we do. But it may not be. There are some kids that may get distracted like that with pictures. Velcro. Remember, kids that are on the spectrum frequently have sensory issues. They may love that Velcro, and that becomes a stimming activity. So you just never know. So you really have to be aware of what are their triggers. Some of them it's auditory. Working with them on a communication mode with voice output, maybe just enough to push them over the edge sensory-wise. They may not like that auditory simulation. For some of them, it may be visual. That may be too visually overwhelming. And so maybe we need to go to something more gestural. So, yes.
If we do like decide to do like a tablet or something, and you're not sure how they'll respond, is there like a trial period? Like,
Well,
how do
yeah,
you
and
do-
typically you're going to try it in the clinic first before you would recommend it. Yeah, absolutely. At least I know that's how we would do it. Although, like Dr. Scarro's patient that I mentioned, I'd already seen her using the devices. I know, and she knows how to access the games, the educational games, as well as the purely fun ones. And so I knew going into it, I kind of already knew that that's probably going to be recommended for her, but it's completely appropriate. Pack some rubber stuff once again, they don't have it. So I'm almost ready to drive to Indianapolis because I know where the Anthem building is. At the time that I lived there, it was the third tallest building in the city. Now you can't even see it when you drive to Indy. Back when I was there, Indianapolis had 3 skyscrapers. If you've been to Indy now, it's not the case. But I'm like, I'm tempted to stand to them, take a picture of you giving it to them, and saying, okay, now you have it. Here's the proof, because I'm tired of the. You have it. What number did you fax it to? Sandy emailed and scanned it. And requested a return receipt. And we got one. So someone got it and opened it. But anyway, so just be keeping in mind that while we don't, you've heard me say, you've heard other instructors say, we treat the patient, not the diagnosis. When it comes to AAC, that diagnosis can and often does have a dramatic impact or have dramatic implications on what it is that we